"Mom, why do you still live like you're poor?" my son asked, and the laughter that followed from around the dinner table felt louder than it probably was. I smiled anyway. At 71, I had learned that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. The restaurant was one of those upscale places Brandon loved, all polished wood, soft lighting, and menus without prices printed beside the specials. His company had just celebrated another record-breaking year, and this dinner was supposed to be a family gathering, a celebration. At least that was what the invitation had said. I sat at the end of the long table, wearing a simple navy cardigan I'd owned for years. Brandon sat near the center beside his wife, Melissa, who looked elegant, as always, in a cream-colored designer dress. Around them were business associates, friends, and a few relatives who seemed impressed by everything Brandon touched. "Seriously, Mom," Brandon continued, swirling the ice in his glass. "You could afford to enjoy life a little. That old Buick is practically a museum piece." A few people chuckled politely. Melissa smiled into her wine glass. "I keep telling her the same thing," she said. "She still shops with coupons." More laughter followed. Not cruel laughter. Not openly. The kind people use when they think they're participating in a harmless joke. I looked down at my plate. The salmon was beautifully prepared. I hadn't touched much of it. "Coupons still work," I said quietly. "No reason to pay more than necessary." Brandon shook his head. "That's exactly what I mean. You act like money is something to fear." The conversation moved on after that. Someone asked about a new office opening in Dallas. Someone else complimented Brandon on a recent magazine feature. The table shifted naturally back towards celebrating his success. I listened without saying much. That wasn't unusual. The older I got, the more people seemed comfortable speaking around me instead of to me. As the evening continued, I found myself studying my son. His expensive watch caught the light every time he lifted his hand. His tailored suit fit perfectly. His confidence filled the room. People leaned closer when he spoke. 15 years ago, I had seen a very different Brandon. A tired young man sitting at my kitchen table long after midnight. A young entrepreneur trying desperately to save a business that was collapsing faster than he could understand. But nobody at this table knew that version of him. Maybe Brandon didn't remember him anymore either. When dessert arrived, Melissa leaned toward me with a sympathetic smile. "You know, Evelyn, there's nothing wrong with enjoying your son's success. Brandon worked very hard for everything he has." I met her eyes. "Yes," I said. "He did." She seemed satisfied with the answer. The conversation drifted elsewhere, yet something about her words stayed with me. Brandon worked very hard for everything he has. Maybe that was true, but hard work wasn't the entire story. Some stories get edited over time. Details disappear. Sacrifices fade. People remember victories and forget who carried them through the losses. By the time dinner ended, the city skyline outside the restaurant windows had turned into a field of glittering lights. Everyone hugged goodbye. Valets brought around luxury cars. Brandon wrapped one arm around my shoulders as we walked outside. "Don't take the jokes personally, Mom," he said. "We're just trying to help you enjoy life." I smiled again. "Of course." He kissed my cheek and headed toward his car. I watched the taillights disappear into traffic before walking toward my old Buick. The engine started on the second try, just like it always did. I sat behind the wheel for a moment without driving away. Then I opened the glove compartment and looked at an old folded document I had carried for years. The number printed near the bottom was still there, for $100,000. Suddenly, for the first time in a very long time, I found myself wondering whether my son remembered where his success had truly begun. I did not drive home right away that night. Instead, I sat in the parking lot with the engine idling softly and watched people come and go beneath the restaurant lights. Expensive cars pulled away one after another. Men in tailored suits shook hands. Women in elegant dresses laughed as they stepped onto the sidewalk. It was a world Brandon seemed perfectly comfortable in now. A world built on appearances, confidence, and success. Eventually, I put the Buick in gear and headed home. My house sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. It was not large. It was not impressive, but every corner held a memory. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The grandfather clock in the hallway greeted me with its familiar ticking. The sound always made the house feel alive, even when I was alone. I hung my cardigan by the door and walked into the kitchen. The same kitchen where Brandon used to sit after school, dropping his backpack onto the floor before raiding the refrigerator. The same kitchen where he once spent hours sketching business ideas on yellow legal pads. I filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. Some people celebrate success with champagne. I preferred tea. As the water heated, I looked around the room. Nothing matched the image Melissa seemed to have of me. I was not struggling. I was not deprived. I simply never saw the point of replacing something that still worked. The dining table was 20 years old. The refrigerator was older than that. My curtains had faded slightly from years of sunlight. None of it bothered me. Every item had been paid for. Every bill had been handled. Every choice had been mine. Yet somewhere along the way, Brandon had begun treating simplicity like a flaw. I carried my tea into the living room and sat beside the lamp that always illuminated my evening reading chair. On the bookshelf stood framed photographs collected over decades. Family vacations, birthdays, graduations. One picture caught my attention. Brandon at 27, standing beside a folding table at a trade show booth. His company logo had been printed on a banner behind him. I remembered taking that photograph myself. He had been exhausted that day. Hopeful, but exhausted. The company was already struggling. Looking at the picture now, I could almost hear his voice from those years. Back then he called nearly every evening. Sometimes he needed advice. Sometimes he only needed someone willing to listen. He would talk about payroll, deadlines, nervous investors, and contracts that never materialized. I listened because that was what mothers did. Not because I expected repayment. Not because I wanted recognition. I simply believed in him. The kettle had long since cooled when I finally stood and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the room. The drawer opened with a familiar creak. Inside sat folders organized with careful labels. Insurance documents, tax records, property papers, decades of ordinary life preserved in neat stacks. My fingers paused over one folder before pulling it free. I did not open it immediately. I already knew what was inside. Still, holding it brought back a feeling I had not experienced in years. Not anger, not regret, something quieter, something heavier. Reflection. I returned the folder to the drawer and switched off the lamp. The house settled into silence around me. Upstairs, I prepared for bed as I always did. Yet Brandon's words lingered in my mind. Not because they hurt, because they revealed something. Success had changed many things in my son's life. The question keeping me awake was whether it had changed his memory as well. The next morning arrived with the quiet rhythm I had always appreciated. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window and settled across the countertop where I prepared breakfast. 2 slices of toast, 1 cup of coffee, nothing complicated. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A delivery truck rolled past the house. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds. Yet my thoughts remained fixed on years I had not revisited in a long time. After breakfast, I drove across town to the small shopping center where I had volunteered twice a week for nearly 6 years. The community bookstore occupied a corner space between a pharmacy and a bakery. Most people who came through the doors never imagined I had once signed paperwork involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. I preferred it that way. At the bookstore, nobody cared about status. They cared about stories. During a quiet moment, I found myself staring through the front window at people passing by. Young professionals carrying coffee cups, parents pushing strollers, retirees walking hand in hand. Everyone seemed to be moving toward something. I remembered a time when Brandon had moved with that same determined energy. 15 years earlier, his company had occupied a cramped office above an auto repair shop. The building smelled faintly of motor oil and old carpet. I visited often back then. Sometimes I would bring sandwiches because he was too busy to leave his desk. Sometimes I would stay only long enough to remind him to eat. Back then there were no luxury offices, no magazine interviews, no investors competing for meetings. There was only Brandon and a handful of exhausted employees trying to keep a dream alive. Around noon, I locked up the bookstore and headed home. On the way, I passed a commercial building downtown. A large banner stretched across the entrance. Brandon's company logo stood proudly at the center. The structure was modern and impressive. Glass walls reflected the bright afternoon sky. Several luxury vehicles filled the executive parking area. I slowed briefly at the traffic light. Then I continued driving. At home, I carried a small box down from the hall closet. Dust covered the lid. The cardboard felt heavier than I remembered. Inside were photographs, receipts, letters, and documents collected over decades. I sat at the dining table and carefully sorted through them. There was Brandon's college acceptance letter, a photograph from his first apartment, a newspaper clipping announcing the launch of his business. Each item told part of a story. Then I found a photograph I had not seen in years. Brandon stood beside me outside a bank. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped beneath an oversized jacket. Yet there was relief in his eyes. Hope. I remembered that day clearly. The company had been running out of options. Payroll deadlines were approaching. Creditors were becoming impatient. Every conversation seemed to end with another obstacle. I turned the photograph over. My own handwriting stared back at me. A date, a location, nothing more. Still, my chest tightened slightly. Not from sadness, from memory. I placed the photograph beside the folder that remained unopened on the table. The afternoon. Sunlight slowly shifted across the room. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the passing hour. I sat quietly, surrounded by pieces of a history that few people remembered anymore. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the truth had been forgotten accidentally, or whether some people had simply found it more convenient to leave it behind. That evening I finally opened the folder. The papers inside were yellowed slightly at the edges, carrying the quiet weight of time. Some people keep jewelry to remember important moments. Others keep photographs. I kept documents, not because I love paperwork, but because life has a way of changing its story when enough years pass. Facts become memories. Memories become opinions. Opinions eventually become something people swear was always true. I spread the contents carefully across the dining table. The first page was a bank statement. The second was a property transfer record. Beneath those sat copies of forms I had signed over the course of several difficult months. Looking at them transported me back 15 years. Brandon had been calling more frequently than usual then. Every conversation carried the same strain beneath the surface. He tried to sound optimistic, tried to sound confident, but a mother notices things other people miss. I heard the exhaustion in his voice. I heard the fear hidden behind every promise that things would improve soon. One rainy afternoon, he arrived at my house unexpectedly. His shoulders sagged as he stepped through the front door. He looked older than 27. The kitchen smelled of chicken soup. I remember because it had been simmering all afternoon. Brandon sat at the table without removing his coat. For several minutes, he stared at his hands. Then he told me the truth. The company was running out of money. Investors had backed away. Loans had been denied. Several employees were considering leaving. Payroll was only weeks away, and he had no clear solution. I listened quietly. When he finished speaking, neither of us said anything for a while. Rain tapped against the windows. The clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Finally, he looked up and said something I had never heard before. He said he thought he had failed. Even now I can remember how difficult those words were for him. Brandon had always been ambitious, always determined. Admitting defeat felt unnatural to him. That evening I did not offer grand advice. I did not tell him everything would magically work out. Instead, I asked practical questions. What did he need? How much time remained? What options still existed? The answers were not encouraging. After he left, I spent several sleepless nights reviewing my finances. There was money from insurance after my husband's passing. There was a small parcel of land our family had owned for years. There were retirement funds I had hoped would provide additional security later in life. None of it represented luxury. It represented stability. Years of careful planning. Years of sacrifice. Yet every time I considered the situation, I saw the same image. My son sitting at my kitchen table, believing his future was slipping away. The decision became simpler than the numbers suggested. Within months, I began liquidating assets. The process was neither dramatic nor emotional. It was paperwork, meetings, signatures, transfers, one step after another. By the time everything was complete, $400,000 had been assembled. I remember meeting Brandon at the bank. The relief on his face arrived before I had even finished speaking. His eyes filled with tears. He stood and wrapped his arms around me. Then he made a promise, a simple promise, one I never asked for. He said he would never forget what I had done. Sitting alone at my dining table all these years later, I looked down at the documents again. The ink had faded slightly. The numbers remained unchanged. Outside, the streetlights flickered on as evening settled across the neighborhood. Inside, the silence felt different now. Not heavier, clearer, because for the first time in years, I was no longer remembering those events alone. The years that followed moved faster than either of us expected. At first, Brandon called constantly with updates. A new client, a successful quarter, an employee he was finally able to hire. Every small victory felt shared. I celebrated. From a distance, proud not because of the money involved, but because I could hear confidence returning to his voice. The fear that had once followed him everywhere slowly disappeared. His company grew beyond the cramped office above the repair shop. Then it moved again, and again. Each new address seemed larger than the last. Somewhere during those years, success stopped being something Brandon chased and became something people associated with his name. Local newspapers began featuring him. Business organizations invited him to speak at events. Photographs appeared online showing ribbon cuttings, awards, and charity galas. I kept a few of the newspaper clippings in a folder. Not because Brandon sent them to me. Usually I found them myself. Around that same time, Melissa entered his life. The first time I met her, she was charming and polished. She spoke confidently about goals, opportunities, and growth. There was nothing wrong with that. Ambition had always surrounded Brandon. At first, I was simply happy he seemed happy. Family dinners became less frequent as the company expanded. Then they became occasional. Then months would pass between visits. When I called, Brandon was often traveling. If I left a message, he usually returned it eventually. Not immediately, not the way he once had. Eventually, I stopped expecting quick responses. Life changes people. I understood that. What surprised me was how often ordinary things suddenly seemed amusing to them. The house I had lived in for decades became a topic of gentle jokes. My old Buick became a running comment at holiday gatherings. The way I saved leftovers. The way I clipped coupons. The way I repaired things instead of replacing them. None of it seemed important individually. Yet each remark landed in the same place. I noticed that Melissa often led those conversations. Brandon rarely started them. He usually smiled and followed along. Somehow that felt worse. One Thanksgiving, Melissa walked through my kitchen examining appliances as though she were touring a museum. Another Christmas, Brandon offered to buy me a luxury vehicle I neither wanted nor needed. When I politely declined, he looked genuinely confused, as if choosing simplicity no longer made sense to him. Through it all, I said very little. Not because I lacked an answer, because I believe people reveal themselves over time. You do not need to argue with someone's values. Eventually, those values speak loudly enough on their own. Years passed. The company continued expanding. New offices opened. Revenue increased. Brandon's name appeared in larger publications. Yet the more successful he became, the less often the early years were mentioned. The late nights, the uncertainty, the sacrifices. Those details slowly disappeared from conversations, replaced by stories about strategy, leadership, and vision. One evening, while organizing old files, I found a handwritten thank you note Brandon had mailed shortly after the company survived its crisis. The paper was folded neatly. The ink had faded slightly. In it, he wrote that he would spend the rest of his life proving that my faith in him had not been misplaced. I sat quietly holding that note for several minutes. Then I placed it beside the other documents on my desk. Because for the first time, I was beginning to see a pattern. Success had not erased the past. It had simply buried it beneath years of applause. 3 days after the dinner, I received a phone call that changed the direction of my thoughts. The voice on the other end belonged to Gregory Shaw. I had not spoken with him in years. Gregory had been one of the first people Brandon hired when the company was still small enough for everyone to know each other's coffee order. Back then he handled accounting, payroll, and whatever else needed attention. He had stayed through the difficult years before eventually retiring. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "it has been too long." We exchanged a few pleasantries before his tone shifted slightly. I was actually calling because I saw Brandon's announcement. I knew immediately what he meant. Earlier that week, a business publication had reported that Brandon was exploring strategic opportunities involving the company. The article used polished corporate language, but everyone understood the meaning. A sale was being discussed. "I saw it too," I replied. Gregory was quiet for a moment. Then he said something unexpected. "You know, most people involved now have no idea how that company survived its early years." I looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass. "I suppose many of them were not around back then," I said. Gregory laughed softly. "That is one way to put it." We spoke for nearly an hour. As the conversation unfolded, memories resurfaced with remarkable clarity. Gregory remembered the months when every expense had been scrutinized. He remembered meetings where employees worried whether payroll would arrive on time. He remembered Brandon trying desperately to hold everything together. Most importantly, he remembered the transfer that changed everything. "I still have copies of the old records," he said. "I kept them after retirement because I never throw anything away." His comment sounded almost casual, yet it stayed with me long after the call ended. The following afternoon, Gregory invited me to meet him for coffee. We chose a quiet diner on the edge of town. The place had not changed in decades. The booths were comfortable. The coffee was strong. Nobody rushed you out the door. Gregory arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase. After we sat down, he opened it carefully and removed several folders. He slid one across the table toward me. Inside were copies of financial records from 15 years earlier. There it was. The transfer, the dates, the supporting documentation, every detail preserved exactly as it had happened. I studied the pages without speaking. Gregory watched patiently. "I always believed Brandon would remember," he finally said. "At first, I think he did." I nodded slowly. That matched my own memories. For years, Brandon had remembered. Then life became busier. Success became larger. New people entered the picture. Old stories faded. Gregory took a sip of coffee. "There is something else you should know." I looked up. His expression had become more serious. "The sale discussions are much further along than the public realizes." He explained that several major firms had shown interest. If negotiations succeeded, the transaction could become one of the largest business deals in the company's history. I listened carefully. Outside the diner window, traffic moved steadily through the afternoon. Inside, the pieces of a larger picture were beginning to come together. Gregory gathered the folders and pushed one toward me. "Keep these copies," he said. "You may never need them, but I think you should have them." As I placed the documents into my bag, I realized something important. The past was no longer sitting quietly in a drawer. For the first time in many years, it had started finding its way back into the light. Over the next 2 weeks, news about the potential sale seemed to appear everywhere. Business journals discussed valuation estimates. Industry websites speculated about buyers. Local newspapers praised Brandon's journey from a struggling entrepreneur to a respected executive. I read a few of the articles and then set them aside. Most followed the same pattern. They described vision, determination, leadership, and growth. None mentioned the difficult months before success arrived. None mentioned the people who stood beside him when failure seemed more likely than victory. One afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Brandon. "Mom, I hope you are doing well," he said. His tone was cheerful, though distracted. I could hear voices in the background. He was probably moving between meetings. We exchanged a few pleasantries before he mentioned the upcoming company event. The board, investors, and senior leadership would be gathering for an important presentation connected to the negotiations. "You should come," he said. "It will be a big day." For a moment I was surprised. Invitations had become rare over the years. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Of course," he replied. "You are family." After the call ended, I sat quietly at my kitchen table. Family. The word lingered in my thoughts. Later that evening, I contacted Daniel Whitmore, an attorney I had known for years. Daniel had handled several family legal matters after my husband's passing. He was thoughtful, careful, and never dramatic. We met at his office 3 days later. I brought the documents Gregory had given me, along with my own records. Daniel reviewed everything slowly. He asked questions. He made notes. Occasionally he nodded. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "These records are exceptionally thorough," he said. "Very few stories survive this many years with documentation this complete." I appreciated the observation because it confirmed what I already knew. The facts were not based on memory alone. They existed on paper. Daniel closed the folder and folded his hands. "What exactly do you want to accomplish?" It was a fair question. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I am not interested in creating a conflict," I said. "I am not interested in embarrassment or revenge." Daniel studied me for several seconds. Then he smiled slightly. "I believe you." The meeting ended shortly afterward. As I walked back to my car, I realized my goal had become clearer than ever. I did not want to rewrite Brandon's success story. I wanted the full story remembered. The invitation arrived the following week. The event would take place at a downtown conference center overlooking the river. Executives, investors, advisors, and potential buyers would attend. Brandon's company had reserved the largest ballroom in the building. On the morning of the gathering, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting a simple navy jacket, the same one I had worn many times before. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. Downstairs, the folder rested inside my handbag. The documents were neatly organized. Every page sat exactly where it belonged. Before leaving, I paused beside the bookshelf and looked at the old photograph of Brandon standing beside that folding table years earlier. He looked determined, hopeful, grateful. I picked up the picture for a moment and then returned it to its place. Outside, sunlight reflected off the windshield of my old Buick. The engine started as reliably as ever. As I pulled away from the curb, I had a feeling that before this day ended, several people would be forced to remember a chapter of history they had spent far too long ignoring. The conference center overlooked the river, its glass walls reflecting the bright morning sky. Inside, everything moved with polished efficiency. Reception staff greeted guests. Investors exchanged business cards. Executives gathered in small groups, discussing projections and opportunities. I arrived quietly and took a seat near the back of the ballroom. No one paid much attention to me, which was perfectly fine. From where I sat, I could see the stage, the presentation screens, and the rows of reserved seating near the front. Brandon moved confidently through the room, shaking hands and greeting guests. Melissa stood nearby, elegant and composed, speaking comfortably with potential buyers and company advisors. Watching them, I understood why people admired them. They looked successful. They looked certain of their future. The presentation began shortly after 10 o'clock. Company growth charts filled the screens. Revenue milestones appeared one after another. Applause followed every major announcement. Brandon spoke with confidence, outlining years of expansion and achievement. The audience responded warmly. By all appearances, it was a perfect day. Then one of the lead advisors stepped forward to discuss the proposed transaction. Numbers appeared on the screen. Valuations, forecasts, strategic plans. The room listened attentively. Near the end of the discussion, Daniel Whitmore quietly entered through a side door. He carried a thin portfolio beneath one arm. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded once before taking a seat several rows ahead of me. The formal presentation concluded to strong applause. Conversations immediately began throughout the ballroom. Investors gathered around executives. Advisors reviewed documents. Reporters prepared questions. It was during this transition that Daniel stood. His voice was calm when he requested a moment of attention. At first, few people noticed. Then the room gradually quieted. Brandon looked surprised. Melissa looked confused. Daniel introduced himself and explained that he wished to clarify an important historical matter connected to the company's earliest years. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Curiosity replaced celebration. Daniel opened the portfolio and removed several documents. He did not speak dramatically. He simply presented facts, dates, records, financial statements, transfer documents, evidence preserved over 15 years. The large screens that had displayed revenue charts only minutes earlier now showed copies of original records. I watched Brandon's expression change as the documents appeared. Recognition came slowly at first. Then all at once, the room remained silent. Daniel explained how the company had survived a critical financial crisis during its earliest stage. He explained where the emergency funding originated. He explained the sacrifices that made those resources available. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was emotional. The truth required no embellishment. Several people in the audience exchanged glances. Others studied the documents carefully. Brandon remained motionless. Melissa attempted to whisper something to him, but he seemed unable to respond. Then another document appeared on the screen, a handwritten letter, his own words from years earlier. The promise he had written after the company survived. The promise never to forget. The room grew even quieter. For the first time that day, nobody seemed interested in valuations or negotiations. The focus had shifted entirely, not toward money, toward memory, toward gratitude, toward a chapter of the company's history that had quietly resurfaced at the exact moment everyone thought the story was already complete. And as Brandon stared at the screen, I could see something happening behind his eyes. He was no longer looking at documents. He was looking at the past. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The ballroom that had been filled with confident conversations only moments earlier now felt completely different. Brandon remained standing near the stage, his eyes fixed on the screen where the documents were still displayed. The investors were silent. The advisors were silent. Even the reporters seemed unsure whether to write or simply watch. Daniel closed the portfolio and returned to his seat. He had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. He had not demanded anything. He had simply restored a missing chapter of history. That was all. Yet somehow it was enough. Brandon slowly turned and looked across the room. Eventually his eyes found me. For a moment, I saw the 27-year-old young man from the old photograph. Not the executive, not the public figure, just the son who had once sat at my kitchen table believing his future was over. He walked toward me without saying a word. The room watched. Melissa followed several steps behind, her expression uncertain. When Brandon finally reached my table, he stopped. He looked down at the documents resting beside me. Then he looked back at me. "I remember," he said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, yet they carried farther than any speech delivered that morning. I nodded. Neither of us spoke immediately. Sometimes silence says exactly what needs to be said. Brandon lowered himself into the chair beside me. His shoulders seemed different somehow. Less certain. More honest. "I thought I remembered everything," he said after a moment. But somewhere along the way, I started telling the story differently. I listened. Around us, conversations gradually resumed, though much more softly than before. Nobody interrupted. Nobody approached. Brandon stared at his hands for several seconds before continuing. "At first, I talked about it all the time. What you did, what it meant. Then the company grew. New people arrived. New successes happened. I kept focusing on the next goal. Then the next one after that." He shook his head slowly. Eventually, I stopped looking back. There was no anger inside me. Surprisingly, there never had been. Disappointment, yes. Sadness at times. But not anger. I placed my hand gently over his. "Success moves fast," I said. "Memory requires effort." His eyes filled with emotion. Not because of the documents. Not because of the audience. Because the truth had finally caught up with him. Melissa sat quietly across from us. For once, she had nothing to add. The polished confidence that usually filled every conversation seemed absent. She looked thoughtful, reflective, human. After several minutes, Brandon asked the question that mattered most. "Why did you bring all of this forward now?" I smiled faintly. "I did not bring it forward for the company." He looked confused. "Then, what?" I glanced around the ballroom. Investors, executives, advisors, reporters, all temporary characters in a much longer story. Then I looked back at my son. "Because I wanted you to remember." His eyes closed briefly. The answer seemed to strike deeper than anything else that day. The sale discussions eventually continued. Business moved forward, as business always does. But something important had changed. Not on a balance sheet, not in a contract, in a relationship. As the afternoon came to an end, Brandon walked me to my old Buick, the same vehicle he had joked about days earlier. Before I opened the driver's door, he stopped me. "Mom," he said, "thank you. Not the polished thank you people offer out of politeness. A real one, the kind that comes from understanding." I smiled and nodded. Then I climbed into the driver's seat. As I pulled away, I saw him standing there in the parking lot watching me leave. For the first time in many years, he was not looking at what I drove, what I wore, or how I lived. He was remembering who I was. And somehow, that was worth far more than any number printed on any document.